She was on her third trip between the garden and the root cellar when he asked her. She had been at it since before the light. This was the way the days had been going since August, up before the dark broke, into the work before she had time to think about the work, moving through it with the particular forward momentum of a woman who understood that stopping was not available to her and had arranged her life accordingly. The beans were coming in all at once, the way beans always did, and the onions needed pulling before the next rain, and the root cellar needed the shelves cleared and reorganized before it could receive what the garden was producing, and Ruth Dean had been managing all of this alone since May, and she was managing it fine, and she did not think about whether she was managing it fine, because thinking about it was not one of the tasks. She came around the corner of the house with the third basket of beans and nearly walked into the man at the garden gate. His name was Caleb Foster, and he had the property adjoining hers to the north, 200 acres of good grassland, and a cattle operation that he ran without noise or drama, which she had appreciated from a neighbor's perspective since they had been neighbors for 3 years. He had helped her in May when her husband died. The way good neighbors helped in such situations, practically, and without making it a thing she would have to manage alongside the grief. He had fixed the north fence and brought firewood and sent his hired hand over for the heavy lifting of the first week. And then he had stepped back and left her to it, which was also exactly right. She had not thought much about him beyond the category of good neighbor. She had not had the space to think about much beyond the category of what needed doing. He was standing at the garden gate with a look on his face that was not quite concern. Concern was what people performed when they wanted you to know they were worried about you, but was something quieter and more specific. The expression of a man who has been watching something for a while and has decided to say a thing about it. "Have you eaten today?" he said. She opened her mouth to answer. She stopped. The automatic yes had been there, assembled and ready. She had been giving that yes since May, to every neighbor and every church acquaintance and every well-meaning person who had asked any version of the question about how she was doing. Because yes was the answer that closed the question and let both parties move on. She had it ready. She did not say it. She thought instead, which was different. She went back through the morning the way you went back through accounts looking for a discrepancy, the 4 o'clock rising, the stove lit, the coffee she had made and drunk standing at the kitchen window watching the dark turn gray, and then the garden, and then the root cellar, and then the garden again, and she went through all of it carefully, and she could not locate a meal in any part of it. There had been the coffee. There had been water from the pump when she came in from the first garden trip. There had been nothing else. She went further back. Supper the evening before, yes, she had eaten supper, but it had been late and small, and she could not say what it had been without thinking hard about it. She looked at him. "I don't remember," she said. It came out without the apology she would have attached if she had planned to say it. It came out as what it was, the truth, plain and slightly startling, the truth of a woman who had been keeping everything together so completely that she had lost track of whether she was keeping herself. He looked at her. He did not say it was all right. He did not say she needed to take better care of herself, which was what people said to widows who had failed at self-maintenance, as if the widow had not grasped the principle in the abstract but simply required someone to point it out. He did not make it into something she would need to manage. He said, "Come in and sit down." He took the basket from her. She let him take it without thinking about it, which was itself notable. She was not generally a woman who let people take things from her. And he went to her kitchen door and opened it and held it and waited. She went in. She sat down. He set a plate in front of her 20 minutes later. Bread, sliced thick and set on the side. Cold sliced beef from whatever remained in the pantry, arranged without ceremony. A wedge of the hard yellow cheese she kept on the cellar shelf, the good kind that lasted. And beside the plate, a cup of the coffee that had been sitting on the back of her stove since the early morning. which he had judged still worth drinking, and poured without asking her preference, because the question of preference was not the relevant question. It was not an elaborate meal, and it was not meant to be. It was a meal that existed because he had gone to her kitchen and looked at what was there and made something from it, and the making of it carried no commentary and no implication and no suggestion that she had failed at something or required rescuing from anything. It was simply food, set in front of a person who had not eaten, by a man who had noticed. She looked at the plate. She looked at the bread and the beef and the cheese and the stale coffee, and she thought about all the meals she had made in the past 3 months. She had made them. She had cooked them and set them out and cleared them away, and she could not account for a single one of them as a thing she had been present for. She looked at him. He was at the counter with his own cup of the stale coffee, standing rather than sitting, not making it into a shared occasion, just there in the kitchen, the way a person is there when they have done what they came to do and are not in a hurry about what comes next. She picked up the bread. She ate. She ate the bread and the beef and the cheese, and she drank the stale coffee, and she tasted all of it, and the tasting was not something she had been doing, she understood now, for quite some time. She had been chewing and swallowing and not tasting, the way you did when eating was a task and not a meal, when the body was managed rather than fed. The bread was good. She had baked it herself on Monday, and it had held. The cheese had the particular sharpness of a cheese that had been aging since September and had arrived at exactly the right point. She sat at her kitchen table and ate the meal Caleb Foster had made from what was in her kitchen, and she was present for it. And she was present in the day. And when she was done, she set her fork down and looked at the empty plate and felt something ease in her that had been held too long. She did not say anything about it. She did not need to. He had seen the whole of it. She had been a widow since the 17th of May, which was the day Martin Dean had ridden out to check the south fence and not come back, and the horse had come back without him at supper time. And she had found him at the base of the ravine where the trail narrowed and the edge was soft from the spring rains. He had not suffered, the doctor said. She had taken this in and set it where she set the other facts of those days, at a careful distance, in the place she put things that were too large to look at directly. She had learned to do this efficiently. You had to, when there was a farm to run. Martin had been 44 years old and healthy and a good horseman, which was the particular cruelty of it. It was not the kind of death you could have seen coming or taken precautions against. It was the kind that arrived on an ordinary afternoon for no reason better than a soft edge and a narrowing trail. And you either made peace with that or you didn't, and Ruth Dean was a woman who made peace with things by looking at them clearly until they became what they were, which was facts. The fact was Martin was gone. The fact was the farm was hers. The fact was the animals needed feeding, and the fence needed mending, and the garden needed putting up, and none of those facts had changed because she was grieving. She dealt in truths, and she dealt in work, and for the 3 months since May she had dealt in very little else. The farm was 60 acres, smaller than most in the county, but it was hers, and Martin's. She still thought of it that way, as theirs, and intended to go on thinking of it that way because the thinking was true even if Martin was not there to share the owning of it. She was not going to let it go. She had made this decision on the morning of the 18th, when she had gotten up before the light and gone out to the barn and fed the animals, because the animals needed feeding regardless of what had happened the evening before. The decision had been made in the barn in the dark, and she had not revisited it. She did not generally revisit decisions once she was certain of them, and she had been certain of this one by the time she came back inside to make the coffee. Her sister in Lincoln had written twice to suggest that Ruth come and stay. Her mother-in-law and Beatrice had written once to suggest she sell the property and move closer to family. She had answered both letters with the warmth they deserved, which was genuine. She loved her sister, and she had been fond of Martin's mother, and she had not gone anywhere. She was where she was. Where she was had the barn and the animals and the garden and the root cellar and 60 acres that she and Martin had built into something that worked. And she was not going to let it stop working because Martin had ridden the wrong way on a spring afternoon and not come back. She was managing. She was managing so completely and so continuously that she had stopped existing in the gaps between the managing. That was what Caleb Foster's question had found. Not a failure, not a collapse, but the gap she had not known was there. The place where Ruth Dean, the person, had been quietly set aside while Ruth Dean, the farm manager, kept everything running. It was not that she had stopped eating, she had been eating. She had been feeding herself with the same efficiency she brought to everything else, adequately at the necessary intervals, without excess or attention. She had stopped eating as a thing a person did for themselves and turned it into a task to be performed, the way she performed banking the stove or filling the water buckets, something that happened because it was time for it to happen, without pleasure or rest or the small dignity of sitting down and tasting it. She did not know when she had stopped. She had not noticed the stopping. That was the thing the question had uncovered. Not that she was failing, but that she had been absent from herself for long enough that she could not account for the basic facts of her own day. That was the gap. And Caleb Foster had found it with 3 words. Caleb Foster did not make anything of the morning beyond what it was. He did not visit the following day in the hovering way of someone who has decided they are responsible for a fragile person and intends to demonstrate this through presence. He did not bring more food. He did not check on her, which was the word people used when what they meant was that they wanted to see with their own eyes that you were still standing, so they could report back. He did none of these things. He came over on Saturday, same as he had been doing since June, because the east fence they shared needed looking at before the fall, and he brought his tools and they walked the line together and found the 3 posts that needed resetting, and he came back Monday with the post driver and the tamping bar. She helped with the posts. She had set fence posts before. Martin had taught her the first summer. Because he believed in a person knowing how to do the things that needed doing on their own land, and she worked alongside Caleb rather than watching. And they moved through the line with the economy of 2 people who can read what the work requires and do it without narrating the process. She had appreciated this about him for 3 years. She had not examined the appreciation, she had simply noted it and gone on. He stayed for the noon meal. She made potato soup from the end of the summer potatoes and bread from the morning's bake, and he ate it with the focused pleasure of a man who had been out in the October cold since 7 in the morning and wanted something hot and was getting something hot and good. She had been making this practice since the question, sitting down for meals, at the table, for the duration of the meal. And she noticed that eating with someone was different from eating alone in a way she had not thought much about before May and thought about often now. It was not that she needed company to eat, it was that company made the meal into an occasion, which made her into a person having an occasion rather than a person completing a task, and the difference was not small. "You're a good cook," he said. The way he said it was the way he said most things, simply because it was true and he had noticed it was true. "I had a good teacher," she said. Martin's mother. She said Martin's name and felt the fact of saying it, which was different from what it had been in June. It came out as what it was, the name of a man she had loved, said in the ordinary course of conversation, without the bracing against it that had been necessary for the first months. "She taught me soup when I was 22 years old and newly married and didn't know what to do with a winter kitchen." He looked at his bowl. "She taught you well. She said thank you, and they finished the meal, and he went back to the fence, and she went to the root cellar with the afternoon's work, and the day was ordinary in the best sense of the word, filled with things that needed doing and done, and herself present in the doing of them, aware of the doing, aware of the cold air coming off the cellar stairs, and the smell of the onions on the shelf, and the sound of the post driver from the east fence line carrying faintly through the October afternoon. I am here, she thought. I am in this day. She had not been in the days for a while. She was back in them now, and the being back in them had started, she understood, with the question. October became November, and November came in the way it came in this part of Nebraska, which was without negotiation and with the kind of cold that reminded you what winter actually was. She finished the putting up, and the root cellar was full, and she turned the garden beds and banked the house foundation against the frost, and she did all of this in the methodical and capable way that was simply how she operated, but she did it now with a different quality than September had had. She was present in it. She was aware of the cold air and the smell of the turned earth and the sound the root cellar door made on its hinges, and the awareness was not nothing. It was the difference between doing and being somewhere while you did. She thought about when that had changed and concluded it was the plate. Not only the plate was what you could point to, the specific concrete thing. But what the plate had contained was the act itself, which was simpler and more important. A man who had looked at her and asked the right question, and when the answer was that she could not account for the basics of her own day, had not made a speech about it, or a project of it, or a reason to hover. He had gone to her kitchen and made a meal from what was there, bread and cold sliced beef, and the hard yellow cheese and stale coffee, and he had set it in front of her, and stood at the counter while she ate, and the whole of it had said, without saying anything, you are a person, and persons eat, and there is nothing complicated about this. She had needed exactly that, and had not known she needed it, and he had provided it without knowing she would need it, and that was the kind of thing that happened when someone had been paying attention. Caleb Foster came by in November for reasons that were practical and sufficient, the East Gate hinge that had been giving them both trouble since September. A question about the creekside water situation going into winter, the south fence corner that needed a look before the hard freeze. He came and did what needed doing and drank her coffee and sometimes stayed for a meal and sometimes did not, and the pattern of it was so ordinary that she was well into it before she noticed she was watching for him. She noticed on a Tuesday, a gray November Tuesday when she was at the laundry, and she heard a horse on the north road, and she looked up from the sheet she was wringing and felt something in her chest settle when she saw it was him coming through the north gate. The settling was small and immediate and entirely involuntary, and she stood with the wet sheet in her hands and looked at it the way she looked at things that warranted looking at, directly, without flinching away from it. She thought about it while she finished the laundry. She thought about it at a careful distance, and then at a closer distance, and then clearly, which was how she arrived at most things she needed to understand. It was not surprising. It was simply true. The question was what she intended to do with it. She hung the sheet and went inside and started the stove for supper, and she thought. She said something about it in December, on an evening when he had stayed past the practical reason for staying, and they had both noticed this without naming it. The fence work was long done. The East Gate hinge had been sorted in October. There was no errand that kept him at her kitchen table, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved toward the door. She had brought out the good lamp, the one she kept for occasions rather than ordinary evenings, and it sat between them on the table and threw its light on the account books she had been going over and the coffee cups they had both long stopped paying attention to. She looked at his cup. The coffee in it was cold. "You've let it go cold," she said. "I know," he set it down. "I was talking. You don't usually talk this much." He looked at the table. The corner of his mouth moved. "I've been making up for a deficit." She looked at the lamp. She thought about the thing she had been working toward for the past several weeks and whether she was ready to say it. And she concluded that readiness was something you achieved by saying the thing, not something you achieved by waiting until you felt ready, and this distinction was one of the things she had learned in 9 months of managing alone. When Martin died, she said, in May, you came and you fixed the north fence and brought the firewood and sent your hand over for the first week, and then you left me to it. He looked at her. I have thought about that considerably, she said. What most people do in that situation is stay longer than is useful to the grieving person because the staying is useful to them. It lets them feel they have done something and be seen doing it and go home with the knowledge that they were present. She looked at the table. You did what was needed and you left when it was done, and I could spend the grief on the grief instead of on managing the people who had come to help me with it. She paused. That was a considerable gift, and I did not tell you so, and I am telling you now. He was quiet for a moment, receiving this. And in August, she said, you asked me a question that had 3 words in it, and you asked it because you had been paying attention to me in the ordinary course of being my neighbor, and when I could not answer it, you went to my kitchen, and you made me a meal from what was there, and you stood at the counter while I ate it, and you did not make a thing of it. She held his eyes. I want you to know that I noticed. That I noticed all of it. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the December wind moved against the house and did not find a way through. I have been paying attention since the morning you and Martin moved in, he said, 3 years ago, April. It was not something I decided to do. It was something that happened and kept happening. He looked at the lamp between them. When Martin died, I did what needed doing because what needed doing was clear. And because I did not know another way to say the thing I could not say while he was alive and could not say while you were grieving him. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of her kitchen, and she thought, I know who you are. She had known who he was for 3 years from the distance of being neighbors, and the distance had closed. And what she could see from here was better and clearer and more specific than what she had been able to see from there. Your coffee is cold, she said. I know. She picked up his cup and went to the stove and poured it out and filled it from the pot that had been keeping since supper, and she brought it back and set it in front of him the way he had set the plate in front of her in August, without ceremony. Because it was the obvious thing and it needed doing. And she sat down, and neither of them said anything further that evening. The things that needed saying had been said. What remained was the good warm kitchen and the December wind outside that could not get in and the lamp burning between them and 2 people who had found each other by way of a fence line and a garden gate and a plate of bread and cold beef and stale coffee on an August morning, which was not the way these things were supposed to happen and was exactly how they did. He asked her to marry him in February, on a morning when the snow was coming down in the quiet way it came, when it meant to stay for the day, not the driving kind, but the steady kind. The kind that settled on the fence rails and the garden beds and the bare branches of the cottonwood by the barn and made the whole of the world look considered. She was at the window watching it. He was at the table with his coffee going cold again, which happened every time he came because he got to talking and forgot to drink it, which was something she had noticed and catalogued alongside the other things she had noticed and catalogued about Caleb Foster over the past months. He said her name. He said what he was asking. He said it plainly, and then he stopped talking and waited, which was entirely consistent with how he did everything. She looked at the snow. She had been on her own for 9 months. She had learned things in those 9 months that she intended to keep because she had paid for them and they were true, that she was capable of the whole of it. The farm and the work and the loneliness and the grief and the ordinary days that kept arriving whether you wanted them to or not. She had learned that she could hold all of it, and she had held all of it, and that was a knowledge that belonged to her and always would. She had also learned, specifically and without any drama, that managing alone and wanting to manage alone were different questions. She had been clear on this since November. She had been patient with the clarity, the way she was patient with things that were true and simply needed time to be acted on. She turned from the window. "Yes," she said. "That's my answer." He picked up his coffee and drank it and set it back down, and she sat across from him and they looked at the snow together through the kitchen window. The February snow coming down on her 60 acres that were hers and Martin's, and now, she supposed, also Caleb's, in the way that things become someone's when they have been tending them alongside you. She thought about an August morning and a garden gate and a question 3 words long that had stopped her mid-step, and the 20 minutes after that, and the plate of bread and cold beef and hard cheese and stale coffee that had been, in its plain and unhurried and entirely unceremonious way, the thing that had brought her back to herself. He had not saved her, she had not needed saving, and she had not been asking for it. She had needed someone to notice, to look at her in the ordinary course of things and ask the simplest possible question and mean it. And he had noticed, and he had asked, and he had set a plate, and the rest of it had come in the ordinary way of things that are simply true and given enough time. The snow came down. The stove was warm. His coffee was going cold again, and she left it because some things you accepted as part of a person and then stopped thinking about, and those things were generally the ones you ended up being most grateful for. She looked at her own coffee, and she drank it while it was still hot, because she had made a practice of that too ever since August, and practices made in the right spirit were worth keeping. She intended to keep this one a long time.